So I was born in upstate New York, went to high school and then college in Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Went back upstate New York for graduate school at Cornell, and then went to law school in Los Angeles. Los Angeles and my first litigation job led me wildly, curiously to Guam, to the South Pacific, this little tiny island, which is a state territory, part of the United States, near the Philippines. Oh man, from Guam, then to Montreal and Pennsylvania, where I went to help my grandfather die. So Montreal, um, and after 16 years in Montreal, now here in Halifax. How is Halifax even here? Oh, there it is. Look, now Halifax. My father was, he'd grown up, he was born in Newark, New Jersey, and moved to New York City where he met my mom. They lived in Greenwich Village, had a very provincial New York life. And when my mother got pregnant with me, it's so funny, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. He really believed that the political situation when would that have been, late 60s, early 70s, was so dire that he needed to buy land in upstate New York. And so he bought 100 acres, and I was born on a farm. My childhood was spent on that farm and then summers there when my parents divorced. But here's where, the story is long and complicated because both of my parents were addicts. And my dad really stayed on that farm, but as my mother got sicker and sicker in her addiction, we moved around a lot. So we moved to Florida. I have this whole life in Orlando that I seldom think about. Those were the years when my mother was like most actively using. I have this whole life in Las Vegas because my father sold the farm and took a corporate gig on the West Coast after many, many years. I guess I was probably 12, by then. And I went to live with him while my mother was in rehab. I have no love for Las Vegas. The parts of my life that feel the most important are my years in Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Because when my mother got clean, again, this is something that I've only started to think about lately. She literally, after we had been apart for 4 years, she said to me, "Where do you want to live?" And I just chose like the blackest place in the world in my imagination at 14 or 15, and it was Baltimore. It was really close to where my grandparents lived in central Pennsylvania. And I imagined it as like a place where black people lived, where there was where there were just like these deep histories of black culture. I had been in mixed environments, but prior to Baltimore, when I was with my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, oh Lord, it was like, it's still lily white Trump country, Oh, it's rough. It's rough. So we ended up in Baltimore, and those were just the best years of my life. I met the core group of friends that are still a part of my life at that high school. I had, think about this endlessly. I had so many black educators. On the way over, I was thinking just today, I didn't really have white female teachers. I had some white men. I had lots of black teachers. And my black educators just invested in me. They saw that I was this sort of all over the place, but very smart little brown girl who could get some scholarship money and do something. And so, when I graduated, I had so many opportunities to go to different schools. I was thinking about this morning. I had NYU, I had Yale, I had Spelman, I had the University of Maryland. I'm sure there were others, but I wanted Howard University, and they were the last one to offer me money to go. But those years between Baltimore and DC were the most formative years. In addition to that free space that I had on that farm, those are the places that really made me who I am. I still love my mama's people in Trump country, but damn, There's a lot of stuff to reckon with when I go there. Um, but the time that I spent in Baltimore and Washington D.C., where I met like this beloved group of friends that I've had for 25 or 30 years, um, led me to graduate school. I went back to upstate New York, to Cornell, decided to take a master's. I had intended to stay there and do a PhD in philosophy. That was my major. And ended up going to law school in LA, which opened up this whole other door and pathway. Oh, let me just talk about Howard.
Yeah.
Howard University. So you know, I won't speak in too broadly, but if you are a black child growing up in Baltimore, D.C., many other urban, rural communities in the United States, and if you have black people who love you and see your brilliance, at some point Howard just comes into the frame because so many brilliant black folks came out of Howard. And I really do feel often like my class, I know it's not true, but my class had Chadwick Boseman. I found these old pictures literally in my Howard stash of Chadwick Boseman, skinny Chadwick Boseman, on stage at a venue I had gone to in 2003 in New York City to watch my friend Camilla Forbes' first, theater performance. Camilla now runs the Apollo in New York City. And, I just feel like the people that were my people were black kids who came from everywhere, but there was just some magic in whatever relationships we made and held on to. We never let each other go wherever we went, and we've literally gone everywhere. So, Howard, I could say so much about Howard. As a child, as a teenager, in my imagination, black educators planted a seed for me that Howard was the Mecca. If you love black people and you love black history and wanted to connect with other black kids who were similarly situated, not by class, because we came from everywhere, then you went to the Mecca. And they're just like on this like cartography of black history. Howard takes up so many points on that map. And that, that period of like 90, when did I come in? 92 to like 97, 98. Chadwick Boseman was younger than me. Those were magic years. They were really, really magical years. And I think the only other thing I want to say about Howard, because this could just be like a Howard and Rachel and her crew interview. Howard prepared me for absolutely anything. It gave me the most expansive understanding of who black people were. And it taught me that I absolutely belonged everywhere in the world, which is something that I teach my children. You have a right to be everywhere, to live everywhere. And Howard taught me that our people were just the most beautiful and vibrant. Like, there's just nobody as bad as us. Like, I don't go around advertising that, but absolutely I talk to my kids in that way in our home all the time. But it also taught me that I could live anywhere. I was prepared. I had encountered so much of us, the fullest, most expansive beauty of us, that it just gave me this confidence to live anywhere in the world, to literally believe that I could go anywhere, had a right to be there. And that's what it was. In addition to the postdoctoral research that I was already doing, which was with this incredible historian who studies the history of slavery in the Maritimes, Harvey Whitfield. That 2-year postdoc really, again, sharpened the research area that I would love to continue studying. And so coming here was, as I've shared with you, it was about quality of life. I knew what quality of life I had on that farm in upstate New York. I didn't need it big cities. I'd lived in LA, Baltimore, DC, Orlando. I'd lived in communities that were huge, and I felt really confident that I would be traveling, although we never expected COVID. Um, but I wanted to be with a group of people who only through my studies really felt like my people. They felt, as an African American, everything that I grew up understanding about African Americans um, felt very, very similar to what I studied and knew in this very limited bubble about who African Nova Scotians were. And there will always be, always, always, always. I mean, I tell my kids this all the time. African Nova Scotians fled, took the opportunity because freedom was offered at a time when your ancestors were enslaved on a Georgia plantation for another 100+ years, right? So for me, the story, the research, there's always a narrative of freedom that we never ever talk about, with respect to African Nova Scotians. So coming here was like, yes, my people are up there. I know they're up there. One of the most difficult things about living in Canada for me has been encountering Black people who just didn't really feel like my people. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, because Black Canada is gorgeous and diverse, but African Nova Scotia is a bomb, and the things that I study, the things that I'm most interested in the archives, the materials I work with, they all point to like this expansive imagination and brilliance that African Nova Scotians had in the 1700s. The legal documents I'm working with now are 1787 legal documents from the Superior Court. And the story, there's always a freedom story in there. There's always. So, my early teachers were all these folks, like this pantheon of folks that are now idolized, right, on t-shirts and stuff. The Panthers, Angela Davis, of course. Who else? Elaine Brown, I remember fondly when she came to Howard University. And I feel like I'll talk about her in just a minute or two. But anything that was about like Black freedom, resistance, revolution in that period of time, like that 66 to 72 period, I was all into. And then I was in relationship with a crew of people who were interested in the Black Arts Movement, right, which was like the artistic component of what we would think of as like the Black Power, Black Freedom movement. So Larry Neal, for example, the Last Poets, right, who we think of as like one of the bedrocks of where hip hop came from. Gil Scott-Heron, was very much alive and around Washington, D.C. at that time before he passed away. Struggling with heroin still, but he was there. And so, those people became my teachers. There was this moment that shifted for me. I still think about it now. In 1998, Joy James published this anthology of all of Angela Davis's readings, and I bought it. But before that, many of the essays that Angela Davis had written, before that anthology collected them, I had worked through some of those essays, and I was really drawn to essays that centered Black women, slavery, and violence or sexual violence. And at the same time as I was reading, so many of the kids that were my peers were like the Panthers kids. So for example, Emory Douglas, the most, visible face of the party because he was their primary artist, right? His art is, like a representation of who the party was. His daughter was, my classmate. So many of my closest friends were the children of Panthers or revolutionaries who had been killed. Jonathan Jackson Jr., I went to school with his son. And so as I was reading and, in relationship with these kids, these students, I realized that there was a part of that 66 to 72 period that had not been spoken, and it had everything to do with sexual violence and lateral violence within the party. And oh man, it really, really put something in my brain that corrupted the sort of flowery image that I had of all these people. And it would take literally 20 years to unravel it in ways that really furthered my learning, like created a much more truthful narrative about who these folks were. And, would just like forever rip off the blinders, about who these folks were. I mean, this is important stuff. As Black people, we have to be very, very mindful about not idolizing other people in the limelight, in political positions, in power, in wealth too damn much, whether it's Jay-Z or, I don't know, damn Huey Newton. We can't do that. And so one of the greatest lessons from that Black Power period, as we, I guess, still refer to it, is that we have to be willing to look for the most or more truthful narratives about what happened during that period. Because what I know now is the weight that befell Black women, the sexual violence and violence that befell Black women, and as a result, really impacted my friends, comes from that period too. The kind of silence, resistance, lateral violence that happens in our own communities around incest and violence against women, I believe, as someone who spends a lot of time in history, also was produced and sort of sustained by that era too. We are so quick to be drawn into revolutionary ideas, my God, without looking at the cost of state violence against Black men, and trickling down the kind of violence that Black women bore in those dynamics. We don't talk about that enough, and that's our legacy too. So to stretch forward to this moment, we have to be this is a beautiful, beautiful moment to think more expansively about what that radical period of resistance and fighting against state violence and the Panthers taught us. Yes, they did the dopest community work. Yes, they loved Black people. And yes, they created tremendous harm in the context of their movements against one another. I struggle with Kwanzaa still because I know what Maulana Karenga did. I know that he was responsible for the execution of our brothers, who were part of the party. And I know that because one of my closest friends wrote a dissertation on us when we were at Cornell. He's a historian now at UCLA. I know these histories, and I want us not to be blinded. I want us to look at those legacies, but to also think more honestly than we've ever thought about what the impact of state violence on those movements, and again, trickling down what the impact of Black men's violence on Black women was, and how that has impacted our work right now, and the blind spots that we have in our movements. We have blind spots. In terms of what happened after May 25th with the execution of George Floyd, it's funny because it's becoming clear to me with time, but immediately after, before, like by the first week, that May 25th to May 30th period, like I knew enough to know what was happening was like we were going to need to spend some years unpacking the significance, the expansiveness of what was happening. We've never, ever, ever had a moment in history where tens of millions of people from 60 different countries on every continent but Antarctica came out into the streets to protest a singular issue, and that issue is anti-Blackness and state violence and the coupling of state violence. And what I have started to teach, and teach my children especially, is the reason for that expansiveness, the global reach, is because the transatlantic slave trade took our people and scattered 15 to 20 million of us all over the world over 2.5 to 3 centuries, whatever we count that number for. And so every single place that Black people touch, given that history of utter subjugation, all of the stuff that it's left us with, means that whether I was in Romania or Istanbul or Berlin or Paris or Montreal or Halifax, all cities that had major protests, right? Istanbul. What I know is that the history of the transatlantic slave trade made the same conditions for Black violence in that place the same as in Montreal, as in New York City, as in LA. So, for me, it's really important that we understand these folks all over the globe, they weren't just responding to Brother George Floyd. They don't care that much about what they witnessed on social media, because you know what? Before him, there was Tamir Rice, there was Philando Castile. I mean, we could do a whole list of names. It wasn't just George Floyd. It was about the whole globe reckoning with the anti-Blackness that was rooted in each singular place. So when I talk about those 60 countries, I want young people to understand that those were not just moves of solidarity about what happened in Minneapolis. That was about Black people reckoning on a global scale with the legacy of anti-Blackness that the transatlantic slave trade has left us with, and yes, and absolutely white people really showing different kinds of solidarity in ways that we've just never seen before. And this is important because Angela Davis talks about this. One of the first interviews she gave after May 25th was about just feeling in her heart this really strong emotion of watching so many white people in the street. And in places I still think about this, in places like Portland, these white kids were getting their asses kicked. They're still getting their asses kicked. Those were the kids who were in the streets night after night after night until midnight. Now, there's some unsavory elements who, we've had to struggle with on the ground, but I think that, what, white folks have shown us since May 25th is really profound. I still don't even know how to, fully talk about it, but I know that we've just never had this moment. And what I also know, and I say to my students and my kids, is that this moment matters because our ancestors were waiting for this moment. They weren't waiting for 1966 and the Black Panther Party, in part. They weren't waiting for 2008 and the election of the first term of President Obama. Maybe. But they were waiting for this moment when there's this global reckoning happening about the history of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, I don't know where it's going from here. I'm watching, trying to attend to it as much as possible. But yeah, this is the moment that our ancestors really prepared for. So we have to pay attention, Gotta pay attention.